Okay, here we go. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I coming through nice and clearly? Okay, jolly good. This is the kind of discussion where I'm tempted to spend the first 15 minutes listing a bunch of defensive caveats, lest I be hauled before some church tribunal and accused of being a heretic and troublemaker. Now, I won't do that, but what I will briefly do is just lay out what it is I am going to do and what I'm not going to do, both things I think are important. Now, first and foremost, my goal today is not to attempt to draw any very hard and fast conclusions. So if that's what you're looking for, then you will be disappointed. Secondly, I should say that I'm not looking for cheerleaders, right? I'm actually not interested in whether anybody accepts a single word that I say today, or I'm not attempting to necessarily change anybody's mind. Nor am I trying to say in any finalistic sense what the role of women in the church actually is. And the final thing I'd say is that I'm not attempting to pander to any religious or political lobby. There's lots of social theorists at the moment who are jumping on social justice bandwagons, and it's not my intention to join them. The long and the short of it, I guess, is this. What I don't want is anyone making any profound declarations prefaced with the phrase, well, Andy said, right? Don't be doing that. So with that out of the way, let me suggest why it is that I'm actually here. My principal interest in this topic is as a biblical interpreter. My primary concern is with how people read and interpret and apply the biblical text. I secondly add that there are a number of biblical scholars, people who I respect greatly, who take a very different position on some of the passages that I'm going to attempt to unpack today. Ultimately, my goal is to encourage people to be confident in questioning their own assumptions, their own biases, and their own baggage. What matters is that as no one, to me, who takes the Bible seriously ought to end up being a parochial traditionalist who's unable to grapple with ideas beyond their own denominational experience. If the Bereans were commended for questioning the Apostle Paul, then I don't think I'm making too great an ideological leap, suggesting that it's worth questioning our own church traditions. So then to my methodology today, needless to say that this topic, Paul and women, is far too convoluted an issue, and the literature on it far too voluminous for me to do it any kind of justice in half an hour or so. So as such, what I'm going to do is interrogate just 3 biblical passages in light of their cultural context. And really, the goal with each passage is to ask a very specific question, which feeds into the broader overarching question, which is, are there more faithful ways of reading these passages? And by faithful, I mean closer to the author's intentions. Now, if there is, if there are more faithful ways of reading these texts, then perhaps there is something other than God's intentions, which is driving the way that a lot of churches understand what Paul says about gender and about the role of women. What might the church look like, I wonder, if we understood Paul in his context before we tried to get him to speak to ours? So I'll survey some of the ancient evidence, including biblical text and some other evidence, asking a specific question of each biblical passage, as I say, pointing towards the much bigger question, are there more faithful ways of reading these passages? And let me be absolutely clear, the difficulty in understanding Paul's view of women comes from Paul himself. Right? Many of the things which he says are difficult to understand. You may remember that the author of 2 Peter chapter 3 has something to say about that as well. It's very difficult to understand some of the texts and also to reconcile them in view of modern understandings of gender equality. So this underscores in my mind why it's important to consider how Paul's audience would have heard these texts and received these words. Paul wrote letters to communities where there were problems, right? He didn't write lectures for 21st century audiences. So in some sense, we shouldn't be surprised that the passages don't necessarily answer all the questions that we have. They were never intended to. So let me begin. This is text number 1. And it's a well-known passage in the debate. Let me just get that out of the way. So Paul writes in 1 Timothy 2, verse 11 through 15. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet, for it was Adam who was first created and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a wrongdoer. But women will be preserved through childbirth if they continue in faith, love, and sanctity with moderation. Now, first of all, let's be absolutely clear what 1 Timothy is all about. The context is in chapter 1 in verses 3 and 4. Just as I urged you upon my departure from Macedonia to remain on at Ephesus so that you would instruct certain people not to teach strange doctrines, nor to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies which give rise to useless speculation rather than advance the plan of God, which is by faith. So I urge you now. Timothy is in Ephesus to address false teaching, and these false teachers appear to have seduced a group of young widows with some free time on their hands, who are now, according to the writer, spreading foolish talk from house to house. So the apostle writes, but refused to register younger widows. This was the plan of action that he took in view of this. For when they feel physical desires, alienating them from Christ, they want to get married, thereby incurring condemnation because they have ignored their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also they become gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. So this corrupting teaching that Paul has advised Timothy to try to counteract is being spread by these widows, and Paul seems to give some rather harsh rulings as a result. But how are we to read them? Women are not allowed to teach or have authority over men. Well, let's firstly remind ourselves where we are. We're told in 1 Timothy 1 verse 3 that Timothy is in Ephesus. This brings me to think of a passage in Acts 18 and a very important couple in Paul's ministry. We read this in Acts 18 in verses 24 and following. Now, a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was proficient in the scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was accurately speaking and teaching things about Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began speaking boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. So we have here Priscilla and Aquila teaching Apollos in Ephesus, i.e. in Timothy's church. Women teaching men was already going on. Now, some people will turn around and say, well, yes, but her husband was there. But I would say to that two things. Firstly, the directive in 1 Timothy 2 is not that women can teach men as long as their husbands are there. It's that women are not allowed to teach men. It's quite plain. However, secondly, and I think more significantly, we ought to consider the relationship between Priscilla and Aquila. Now, they're actually mentioned as a couple with the word "and" between them 5 times in the New Testament. I've listed the passages on the screen. As you can see, in each case, apart from the one in green in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 19, Priscilla's name is always mentioned first. Now, in a culture where women are either not mentioned at all, mentioned only in relation to a significant male, or at best mentioned second in a list with men, this is actually startling. Now, in the scholarship, there are 2 plausible reasons for this. It could be that Priscilla is of a higher social class than Aquila. I personally reject that idea on the basis that Paul seems to go out of his way to explain that social class means nothing to him. As you can see in this passage that's now on the screen in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul talks about the calling of some of the Corinthians and says there in verse 27 that God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, the weak to shame the things which are strong, and the insignificant things of the world and the despised God has chosen, so that the things that are not, and those things they may be nullified, so no one can boast before God. In other words, Paul takes no account of social class. The other reason that Priscilla's name seems to be mentioned first always when the couple is mentioned is that she was the more prominent, confident, or gifted teacher. And that seems to me to be the case. As such, R.H. Lenski writes in his book, Great Personalities of the New Testament, she, talking about Priscilla, was by nature more gifted and more able than her husband, also spiritually fully developed due to her having had Paul in her home for 18 months in Corinth. The New Testament scholar Adolf von Harnack describes them as Priscilla the missionary with her husband Aquila in his book, The Expansion of Christianity. So if women were already teaching men in Timothy's church, Paul's injunction would sound rather strange indeed. We're told that Paul wanted women to learn in silence and in submission. But this is not because they were women, but rather this is because the way all students were expected to learn in antiquity, for which there is a wealth of evidence. I'll mention just 2 lines of evidence. The writer Isocrates ordered Greek students to be silent. Rabbi Akiva, who's actually a contemporary of St. Paul, likewise commended silence for learning. He writes, in one of, I think it's in the Mishnah, but don't quote me. The tradition is a fence around the law. Tithes are a fence around riches. Vows are a fence around abstinence, and a fence around wisdom is silence. Silence actually points to a quiet demeanor to learn. So Paul actually wanted women to be educated in a culture that frowned upon women's education. So again, try to think of how these texts would have sounded to their original audience. Paul wanted women to be educated. Now, Roman elite women were often educated, but most women in the Roman Empire were only taught to be wives and mothers. Livy, the eminent Roman historian, observed in his history that a woman's mind is influenced by little things. Publilius Cyrus expresses this in his work Sententiae. A woman who meditates alone meditates only evil. Even the Stoic philosopher Seneca, whom the one-time tutor to Emperor Nero, writes in his Greek tragedy, Phaedra, when a woman thinks, she thinks evil. And things weren't much different in Paul's own Jewish culture. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it records a story of a woman asking a rabbi a question about the Torah, which the rabbi refuses to answer on the grounds that, quote, a woman's wisdom is only in her spinning wheel. He goes on to say that he would rather, quote, let the words of the Torah be burnt than given to women. It was in this environment that Paul encouraged women to learn. So what then about his validation of women not being able to teach on the basis of Eve's transgression? Well, remember, Paul doesn't want these widows who've been hoodwinked by the false teachers to be going around and usurping authority from other church teachers. Now, the first thing to note here, and it's clear, I think, from this verse, that for Paul, Eve is an index for one who has been deceived by false teaching and not trained in divine instruction. So he writes this in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 3, and this is addressed to the Corinthian church. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his trickery, your mind will be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Now here, Paul doesn't have any woman in mind. Eve here stands for those people who he thinks are on the verge of being deceived in the Corinthian assembly, men and women. So clearly the Eve example is not confined to women. It's not Eve's gender that's at issue in 2 Corinthians 11, but the fact that she was deceived. And I suspect it's the same thing that's going on in 1 Timothy 2. Now, the issue in the Genesis narrative is this. The command not to eat from the tree was not given to Eve. The command was given to Adam. Eve was formed second, as Paul writes, and so only had the information secondhand from Adam. So in Paul's mind, and this was true in the rabbis' minds as well, and the rabbis were very, very disparaging about Eve, Eve was more susceptible because she was formed second and she only had the instruction from Adam, not directly from God. And as such, Eve was more susceptible to deception. And in this case, of course, in the garden, the ultimate form of false teaching, the serpent whose command directly contravened a command of God. It's the order and sequence of things that matters to Paul and not gender. Paul didn't want these women usurping authority from the church leaders or the church teachers in the house churches, because just like Eve had not heard God's command directly and was deceived by the serpent, these widows had not been trained in the word and had themselves been deceived by these false teachers. And what they needed to do in Paul's mind was stop going from house to house and spreading things they didn't understand, but to take the time to learn and be educated. But what then are we to do with Paul's line about being saved through childbearing in verse 15? Well, if Paul's comments are aimed at these widows, as I think they are, and as an increasing number of scholars think they are, then his comments make sense if we assume he means saved in the sense of rescued from getting into any trouble which arises from spreading this false teaching. In fact, if you go back to 1 Timothy 5 and you read the passages after verse 13, that's precisely what they actually say. But the notion of being saved in the final judgment, the notion of being saved at the end of time by having babies has no basis whatsoever in early Christian thought. So this text, it cannot apply to all women in that sense. A typical reader of Paul's day would probably understand it as meaning something like a safe delivery through childbirth, as many women died in childbirth. Given the future tense of the verb, will be saved through childbirth, personally, I don't think that's the case. But when all the evidence is collated, the way that Paul uses Eve elsewhere, the prominence of Priscilla, the fact that Priscilla was teaching a man in Ephesus, the immediate context of false teaching, and the fact that there is no precedent whatsoever for women finding salvation through giving birth to children, I find the traditional reading of this passage utterly unpersuasive. I don't think 1 Timothy 2:11-15 bars women from teaching. So that's the first text, and I may not have mentioned the critical question there. My apologies if I forgot to. The critical question to ask there is there evidence for a localized situation? In other words, are there reasons to believe that those directives in 1 Timothy 2:11-15 are not binding for all time? And as I've just explained, I don't think they are. I don't think it would make sense in that context. Text 2 is 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34-35. And the key question here is, what does cultural context tell us? So again, Paul writes, as in all the churches of the saints, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are subject to themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Or was it from you that the word of God first went out, or has it come to you only? Now, for that lobby that insists that women are not allowed to teach in church and has to maintain this demeanor of submission at all times, this passage is a favorite. If you've ever looked at the Biblical Manhood and Womanhood website run by John Piper and Wayne Grudem, this is one of their favorite go-to passages. Now, much like the previous passage, I think it cries out for rethinking, simply because not 3 chapters earlier, in chapter 11, Paul is outlining the grounds upon which women can pray and prophesy in the assembly. So unless Paul had some inexplicable disconnection in his own thought, this passage cannot simply mean that women are not allowed to speak in church and have to keep quiet. So this is how I understand this passage to be working. I think it works on the basis of a strategy that Paul actually uses a few times in 1 Corinthians, and that is to quote a well-known saying and then refute it. He does it a couple of times in chapter 6, 1 Corinthians, and again in 1 Corinthians 7. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 6, he quotes this well-known saying, all things are permitted for me. That's the well-known saying. Then he offers his refutation, but not all things are of benefit. Again, he says, all things are permitted for me, that's the saying, but I will not be mastered by anything. That's Paul's refutation. Then in verse 13, food for the stomach and the stomach for food. You can kind of imagine some Corinthians saying that if you think about the communion meal in 1 Corinthians 11. But then Paul refutes that by saying, however, God will do away with both of them. Then this saying, which it seems was going around the church as much as possibly in some avenues of society, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That's the saying. But then Paul's refutation, but because of sexual immoralities, each man should have his own wife and a woman have her own husband. Now, my proposal is that this is the thing that Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34 and 35. And here are my reasons. As I say, this again is I want us to think about how cultural context can help us understand some of these very challenging passages. Now, following the Punic Wars, this is a couple of centuries before Paul's time, Hannibal's armies crushed Rome. And as part of Rome's rebuilding strategy, they attempted to limit the freedom and the financial independence of women. A number of these women, because of the war and because of the depleted workplace, had taken up executive positions and had become quite bourgeois and quite rich. the feeling was that the amount of money that was being spent needed to be saved so that Rome could recover from the Punic Wars. So as such, a law was introduced known as the Oppian Law. And here's a quotation from the Oppian Law. Amongst other things, it was aimed at severely limiting the movements of women. And it says that no woman should wear on her person more than half an ounce of gold, or use garments of variegated colors, or ride in a carriage in any city or town, or within a mile's distance of one, unless when she was going to observe public festivals. Now, long after Rome recovered from the Punic Wars, and it didn't take long for Rome to recover, the law stayed in effect. And this led to huge protests of disenfranchised women. And it led to widespread opposition from Roman elite men who felt like women should stay in their place. They wanted the effects of the Oppian Law to stay in place. Now, probably the most vocal and most well-documented of these opponents of women regaining their freedom was the celebrity politician Cato. And Cato's speeches were recorded again by the Roman historian Livy. And again, I want to just include this. It's actually a shorter quote. The speech is huge. But this is what Cato said in response to the protests of women who were trying to regain their freedom in opposition to the Oppian Law. At home, our freedom is conquered by female fury. Here in the forum, it is bruised and trampled upon. And because we have not contained the individuals, that is, these women who are on the streets, we fear the lot. Indeed, I blushed when a short while ago I walked through the midst of a band of women. I should have said, what kind of behavior is this? Running around in public, blocking streets and speaking to other women's husbands. Could you not have asked your own husbands the same thing at home? And I've put in the quotes there, note the important echo of Paul. Couldn't you have just asked your own husbands at home instead of being out here protesting on the streets? Are you more charming in public with others' husbands than at home with your own? And yet it's not even fitting at home for you to concern yourselves with what laws are passed or repealed here. Our ancestors did not want women to conduct any, not even private business without a guardian. They wanted them to be under the authority of parents, brothers, or husbands. If they are victorious now, what will they not attempt? As soon as they begin to be your equals, they will have become your superiors. Can you hear the patriarchy? Can you hear the sense of women have their place? This speech, it could have been home in the suffragettes movement. But what it seems to me, and to a growing number of biblical interpreters, is this, that this first bit, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are subject themselves, just as the law says, if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it's improper for a woman to speak in church, is a saying from the outside. And then we get Paul's refutation. Or was it from you that the word of God first went out? Or has it come to you only? So I think that's what's going on. Now, in the lengthy section before verse 34 here, Paul's been talking about how tongues and prophecy should be used in the assembly and how it should be done in orderly fashion. He went into considerable detail explaining the grounds upon which women could engage in prophecy in chapter 11. How then could he suddenly, in chapter 14, suddenly turn around and say women can't prophesy, they have to stay silent? It simply, as it stands, would make no sense. However, the context of 1 Corinthians and the cultural context of views towards women at the time, I think, make this alternative reading far more plausible. As Paul argues for orderly worship, what I think he does is quote an element of worldly disorder, that is the subjugation of the female voice. But among the people of God, where Paul stresses the equality of male and female, such subjugation is out of place. And as such, the call for women to be silent makes more sense than the worldly command, which he then refutes by asking the members of the Corinthian community trying to subjugate the female voice, was it from you that the word of God first went out, or has it come to you only? And so we move to our final passage, or set of passages, and final critical question. And I am aware of the time. I will try to get through this as quickly as possible. So these are the text. The final critical question I want to raise is the notion of the church as counter community. So in Colossians 3, we read here, wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Then a selection of passages from Ephesians 5. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husband as you are to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. Each of you should love his wife as himself, and a wife should respect her husband. Now, as modern Christians, when we hear these passages often referred to as the household codes, we immediately hear masculine authority. Wives, be subject to your husbands. But as first century Christians, Paul's original audience would immediately have heard the opposite. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This would have shocked the ears of first century audiences. Throughout Ephesians and Colossians, Paul stresses how the church has been rescued from the world and as such ought to conduct themselves differently from the world. We see that in all through these two letters. I've quoted just two passages here so we can see it. So in Ephesians 4, he writes, so I say this and affirm it in the Lord, that you are no longer to walk just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their minds, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And in Colossians 3, therefore, if you've been raised with Christ, keep seeking the things that are above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Now, if Paul is telling the church that you should be different from the world, it makes no sense to me that the household codes in Colossians 3 and Ephesians 5 would simply be telling the church to be like everyone else, to live under Roman patriarchy. Again, a few examples from Greco-Roman authors about households will make it clear how the early Christians would have heard Paul. My first quote, I don't think I've got these quotes on, I've just got one in there, but I'll read these. My first quote is from the writer Valerius Maximus in his 9 books of memorable deeds and sayings. He tells these two stories. Firstly, of Ignatius Metellus, who took a cudgel and beat his wife to death because she had drunk some wine. Not only did no one charge him with a crime, but no one even blamed him. Everyone considered this an excellent example of one who had justly paid the penalty for violating laws of sobriety. He then writes about the Roman consular, Herodes Atticus, who kicked his pregnant wife Regilla to death. Then, after a famous sham display of grief, was acquitted in the court case and was even celebrated by philosophers, one in particular called Philostratus. Even Emperor Constantine killed his second wife, Fausta. He drowned her in a boiling hot bath because of suspected but unproven adultery. And if I remember rightly, the adultery was with her stepson, Constantine's son from his first wife, but it was never proven. It's into this environment that Paul writes, husbands, love your wives and never be harsh with them. And husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. This is why women flocked to the early church. Female subjugation was actually enshrined in Roman law. Male guardianship was assumed. Women weren't allowed to own property or own businesses without a significant male other. Listen to Aristotle's household code. And this is one of the key planks for Roman thought on the place of women in the household. Of household management, we have seen that there are 3 parts. One is the rule of a master over slaves, another of a father, and a third of a husband. A husband and father, we saw, rules over wife and children, both free, but the rule differs. The rule over his children being a royal, over his wife, a constitutional rule. For although there may be expectations to the order of nature, the male is by nature fitter for command than the female. The inequality between male and female is permanent. The courage of a man is shown in commanding, of a woman in obeying. All classes must be deemed to have their special attributes. As the poet says of women, silence is a woman's glory, but this is not equally the glory of man. This is Aristotle, one of the most influential philosophers ever, a student of Plato. And this household code was the basis of most Roman thought towards the household and how it should work. It was into this cultural context that Paul wrote, subject yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. This was what the Christians would have heard. This is how they would no longer walk as the Gentiles walked. When Paul then goes on to command wives to be subject to their husbands in everything, his explanation is not submit to your husband's superiority, as we see here in Aristotle, but rather submit to your husband's love. This is why women are told to submit to their husbands as is fitting in the Lord. In the Lord, you would only respond to love and not to subjugation. Paul continues, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the word, of water with the word, that he might present her to himself, the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Again, try to hear these words as someone who had been indoctrinated with Aristotle's domestic ethics. Husbands, be ready to give yourself up for your wife. That would have made no sense to a Roman. Why would the superior give himself up for the inferior? Paul goes on. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, and no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are parts of his body. This passage is immensely powerful because it elevates the sanctity of the female body in a cultural context where the female body was considered inferior. Again, consider the following evidence. Sexual assault was commonplace in the empire, and a woman wasn't even allowed to report rape. A man had to do it for her. Now, according to the ancient historian Livy, the rape of Lucretia, which is probably the most famous and well-documented rape of antiquity, actually led to her killing herself. And it was because of this reason that the Roman government did away with the system of monarchy and introduced the Republic. It was because of these officials who raped Lucretia. In fact, a rape myth even lay at the heart of the founding of Rome. Again, Livy tells us that the priestess Rhea Silva was raped by the god Mars, and their son, the son that came out of the rape, was Romulus, the very founder of Rome. In his work, Generation of Animals, Aristotle again writes this: the female is, as it were, a deformed male, and that because females are weaker and colder in their nature, we should look upon the female state as if it were a deformity. The famous 2nd century physician Galen wrote in his work on the usefulness of parts of the body that women were imperfect men who lacked the heat to expel their sex organs. That's his explanation of why female genitalia is internalized while male genitalia is external. It's into this environment that Paul instructed husbands to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. I would add to that his statement here in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband also does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. It's statements like these by which Paul challenged the patriarchy of Rome, rather than calling the churches simply to blend in, which called them to stand out, I think, in some uniquely revolutionary ways. In other words, these so-called household codes that we see in Colossians and Ephesians, far from being texts which subjugate and imprison women, actually liberate and celebrate the value of women and men equally. Now, as 21st century Westerners, we naturally pick up on any statement talking about submission, and we fail to hear these passages the way that the earliest believers would have heard them. These passages should be understood as resistance narratives, challenging the misogyny, the patriarchy, and the male domination characteristic of the empire, and as I would argue, characteristic even of today. The 2nd century pagan author Celsus wrote this about the church. He described Christianity as a religion of the foolish, dishonorable, and stupid, and only slaves, women, and little children, led by wool workers, cobblers, laundry workers, and the most illiterate and bucolic yokels. Notice what he said. Notice the inclusion here of women and slaves. It's precisely because of these kinds of countercultural claims that Paul makes that those who were considered on the lowest rungs of the social ladder, slaves, women, and children, flocked to the ancient Jesus movement. Look at what Paul says about slaves. Slaves, obey those who are your human masters in everything, not with eye service, as people pleasers. Now, the fact that Paul even includes slaves in the conversation is in itself fairly revolutionary. But secondly, people, of course, they'd all agree with this bit: slaves, obey your human masters. But then Paul explains, he doesn't say obey them because you are inferior to them, but rather, as you see there in the second half of Colossians 3:22, with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. And then he gives this command to the masters in chapter 4, verse 1. Grant your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Again, Paul resists imperial domination and superiority in all its forms. Sexism, classism, racism, none of them would have a place in the ancient Jesus movement, nor should they in the modern. So in conclusion, I reiterate that my goal today is not to sway anybody's thinking in a particular direction. What you believe is between you and your own conscience. But the natural question to ask is, where do I think all this leads? Am I suggesting that men are not to be the spiritual leaders of women, or that women should be able to lead congregations or preach sermons and teach in churches? Naturally, I have views on all of those things, which I'm not going to divulge. But what I would say is this: the thing that motivates me to interrogate these ideas is my desire to see the Bible interpreted and applied in a way that's faithful to the demands and the objectives of our God. I've got no ulterior motives. I've got no secret plan to alter the social landscape of any church community, or to simply hack off some Christian leaders just for my own entertainment. But if we agree that the Bible is our foundational text and central to the way in which we conduct life, then meticulous and thorough biblical interpretation is our collective responsibility. And it's one that I take far more seriously than I do the traditions or practices of any church. Thank you.